There is a moment that almost nobody warns you about, and it is not the moment you take on the debt. It is not the moment you decide to pay it off. It is not even the moment you make the last payment. It is the moment about 3 days after the last payment clears when you look at your bank account and realize that the number that used to leave every month is just sitting there, and you do not entirely know what to do with it. And that moment, quiet, a little disorienting, not at all what you imagined when you were grinding through the payoff, is actually the most financially significant moment of your adult life. Because what you do in the weeks immediately following that last payment will determine whether you build something real or whether the money quietly disappears back into your lifestyle and you arrive at next year in roughly the same position you were in before, just without the debt. Which sounds fine until you realize that without the debt and without the redirect, you have not actually changed your trajectory. You have just removed a ceiling without building anything underneath it. And this video is about what actually changes after the last payment, not the number on the screen, not the emotional release, not the Instagram post about being debt-free, but the structural changes that happen to your cash flow, your decision-making, your risk tolerance, your career options, your health, and your compounding curve. Because most people treat debt payoff as the finish line, and it is not. It is the starting line for something most people in debt cannot even properly imagine yet. So let us start with the cash flow, because this is where the change is most immediate and most dangerous if you are not paying attention. When the payments stop, the money does not announce itself. It does not arrive in a separate account labeled freed capital. It just stays in your checking account with everything else. And the research on what happens to that money without a deliberate plan is not encouraging, because studies on consumer behavior consistently show that without a pre-committed destination for newly freed cash flow, the majority of it gets absorbed into lifestyle inflation within 6 months. Not dramatically, not a new car or a vacation, just quietly. An extra dinner out, a subscription you did not cancel, a slightly more expensive version of something you used to buy cheap. And within 2 quarters, the money is gone and you are not in debt anymore, but you are also not building anything. And this is the first and most important thing that changes after debt payoff, which is that for the first time in however many years, you have a choice about where a significant portion of your income goes. And that choice is either intentional or it defaults to entropy. And entropy wins unless you decide before the last payment clears exactly where the money is going the day after it does. Now, let us talk about what the math actually looks like when the redirect is intentional, because this is the part that changes people's understanding of what they were actually losing while they were in debt. And the number is not the interest rate. The interest rate is just a percentage on a screen. The number that matters is the compounded future value of every dollar that left your account in interest payments instead of investment contributions. And when you run that number, most people go quiet for a moment. Because if you were paying $1,200 a month in debt service and you redirect that to a basic index fund earning 8% annually, in 10 years, you have $220,000. And in 20 years, you have $712,000. And you did not get a raise, you did not start a business, you did not inherit anything. You just stopped sending money to a lender and started sending it to yourself. And the math that was working against you for years in the form of compound interest on debt flipped sides and started working for you in the form of compound growth on investments. And this flip, the simple directional change in where the compounding goes, is the entire game. It is the whole difference between two people with identical incomes who end up in completely different financial positions 20 years from now. And the one who ends up ahead is almost never the one who earned more. It is almost always the one who freed the cash flow earlier and redirected it deliberately. But the cash flow is only the first thing that changes, and honestly, it might not even be the most important one, because what also changes after the last payment is your relationship with risk. And this one is harder to quantify, but it is the change that tends to produce the most significant long-term consequences. Because when you are carrying significant consumer debt, Every decision you make that involves any financial uncertainty gets filtered through one silent question that you've probably never written down, but you run constantly, which is, can I still cover the payments if this goes wrong? And that question is not irrational. It is completely reasonable given your actual situation. But it is also a ceiling because it means you cannot take the job with better long-term upside if the base salary is slightly lower. You cannot go part-time while you build the thing you actually want to build. You cannot take the unpaid opportunity that would get you the credential that changes your trajectory. You cannot make the lateral move to the company with better equity because the short-term risk math does not work. And all of these decisions compound just like money does, which means the career you build while carrying debt is structurally different from the career you build without it. Not because you are less capable, but because every branching point where the higher upside option carried any uncertainty, you had to take the safer one. And over 10 or 15 years, those branching points add up into a trajectory. And the trajectory of someone who could never afford to take a risk is materially different from the trajectory of someone who could. And this is the thing almost nobody talks about when they talk about debt, because we talk about the interest rate and we talk about the balance and we talk about the payoff timeline, but we almost never talk about the opportunity cost of the decisions you did not make because the payment math did not allow it. And that opportunity cost is real, and it is large, and it is permanent in the sense that you cannot go back and take the 2019 version of the risk that would have paid off by 2024. So let us talk about what happens to the risk calculation the moment the payments stop, because this is where things get interesting, because it is not just that you have more money, it is that the floor of what survival costs drops. And when the floor drops, the ceiling rises, and decisions that were genuinely too risky before become reasonable after. Not because you became braver or more reckless, but because the actual math changed. One bad quarter does not cascade into missed payments and damaged credit and stress that compounds into worse decisions. One job transition does not create a crisis. One slow month does not threaten the whole structure. And when that changes, people make different choices. Better choices, not in a motivational sense, but in a purely mathematical sense. The expected value of taking the higher upside option goes up because the downside scenario got less catastrophic. And this is why you will consistently find that people who eliminate consumer debt and then redirect the cash flow intentionally tend to see career acceleration in the years that follow that has nothing to do with the investment account growing. It is the decisions they finally had room to make. And then there's the part that the spreadsheet does not capture at all, which is what happens to your brain. Because a 2019 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences tracked people before and after their debts were eliminated, not reduced, eliminated, and found that anxiety dropped from 78% of participants showing clinical symptoms down to 53%, a 25 percentage point reduction in diagnosable anxiety from closing debt accounts alone. And more importantly for our purposes, cognitive performance improved. People made measurably better financial decisions after debt elimination. They became less impulsive, less likely to take the short-term option at the expense of the long-term outcome. And the reason for this is that the brain does not experience debt as a number. It experiences it as an open threat. And managing an open threat uses cognitive resources constantly and quietly in the background, resources that would otherwise go toward higher order thinking, career planning, creative risk assessment, long-term decision-making. And when the threat closes, the resources come back online. And people who have been through this often describe it not as feeling richer, but as feeling clearer, like a background process they did not know was running finally stopped, and they suddenly had more processing power for everything else. And Northwestern University researchers found separately that carrying high debt-to-asset ratios correlates with measurably higher blood pressure and worse self-reported health outcomes, even after controlling for income, meaning this is not a metaphor. The debt was a physiological burden, and when it closed, the body noticed, the same way the mind did. So
Here's what the sequence actually looks like for someone who does this right. And the sequence matters because the order is not arbitrary. The day the last payment clears, you do not immediately open a brokerage account and start buying index funds. The first move is to pause and rebuild the emergency fund to 6 months of expenses in liquid savings. Not because investing is bad, but because the whole point of what you just did is to stop being one bad month away from putting something back on a card. And if you invest before you have the cushion, then one unexpected expense sends you back to the beginning, and you haven't actually changed the structure. You've just changed the label on the problem. So 6 months liquid first, then you capture the full 401k employer match because that is a guaranteed 50 to 100% return on those dollars before the market does anything, and nothing else in personal finance competes with it. Then you max the Roth IRA at $7,000 for 2025 because every dollar in there grows completely tax-free and the IRS never touches the gains ever. Then you max the 401k contribution limit at $23,500 for 2025. Then everything remaining goes into a taxable brokerage account in low-cost index funds set to auto-invest. And if you are redirecting $1,000 a month through that sequence at 8% annually, you have $183,000 in 10 years and $593,000 in 20. And you did not need a windfall. You didn't need a promotion. You needed the payments to stop and the redirect to be intentional before the money had a chance to disappear back into your lifestyle. And here's the last thing that changes after the last payment, and it is the one that is hardest to explain to someone who has not experienced it yet, which is that your relationship with time changes. Because when you are in debt, you are always managing the present. You are always making sure this month works. You are always one step ahead of the payments, and the future is something you think about abstractly, but cannot fully inhabit because the present keeps demanding your full attention. And when the payments stop, you suddenly have cognitive and emotional access to a longer time horizon, and you start making decisions on a 5 and 10-year basis that you could not make before because the 3-month horizon kept eating everything. And this longer time horizon is itself a compounding advantage because the decisions you make when you're thinking 10 years out are structurally different from the decisions you make when you're thinking 3 months out. And over time, those decisions build a different life. Not a luckier life, not a higher income life necessarily, just a life built from a longer horizon with more room to make the choices that actually matter. So if you're still in the payoff phase, still grinding through the avalanche or the snowball or whatever method you chose, the point of this is not to make it feel easy, because it is not easy. It's slow at the beginning, and it requires saying no to things that feel reasonable, and it requires running numbers that are uncomfortable to look at. The point is to make sure you understand what's on the other side, not just the absence of the payment, but the presence of everything the payment was blocking: the cash flow, the risk tolerance, the career decisions, the cognitive clarity, the compounding curve, all of it waiting on the other side of the last payment for the people who get there and know what to do when they arrive.